But I do understand why. And I will say, am like someone who cares about criminal justice reform. So it's not that I don't care about people being falsely accused, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. So I do understand. And I think they put it in a way that I was like, I can see a lot of people reacting badly to this.
Yeah.
But I do completely understand and take their point.
And, you know, I agree with you that I think whenever they first bring it up, I was just like, wait a minute, where are you taking this? Because
I kind of did just like eye roll, like, okay.
Yeah. But
has the Me Too movement gone too far? And like, motherfuckers are still getting away with rape, so no.
Right. You know, but it was interesting because they were kind of like, you know, trying to approach that question of like, you know, has it changed too much or like not nearly enough? So they were like sort of like grappling with this, where they would see like these old structures of like sex and power and like how we've like, all right, we're getting rid of that, you know, like Weinstein kind of like set this precedent where we can like clear that out of the way, but we're not really sure what's sort of taking place. Like what you were mentioning is the, you know, can we get some of these situations down to like a legal case? They bring up Aziz Ansari, for example, and the reporting on that one is, you know, hard things to confirm. It was like from a single accuser, and there wasn't like repeated stories, so it was like a much lower level of like journalistic standards.
They even straight up said that they would not have printed that, and that they think that most reputable
news
like
sources
would not have, and that's why it came out on a site that no one had ever heard of.
Right. Well, and so that one, because they were like, it's like even reading the whole full thing, you know, it's kind of hard to tell if you know, this was just him being overeager and clueless, or like was it something worse? So I think dealing with like that sort of question too was something that they were trying to pull forward, where, you know, originally the Me Too movement started by Tarana Burke, so was started to promote, you know, empathy and healing among survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse, but, you know, is now being used to sort of like highlight the bad behaviors all across the board, whether it was just sexual harassment, sexual assault, or even like maybe that was an uncomfortable date, you know, like, and where's that sort of line? And
or just being an asshole who's like very insistent about having sex to someone who may not be interested, and all of those gray areas in between affirmative consent and you know, assault.
Yeah. And then there's, I mean, after, you know, the sort of like reckoning that we were talking about, where it's like, I feel like you couldn't go a day where there was not another person in the headlines for, you know, some kind of accusation. So as those were building, I think critics of the movement started coming out and sort of protesting that it was too broad and like maybe losing credibility, because they were bordering on these scenarios that, you know, would be like a hard thing to like, you know, take to the courtroom, for example.
It does remind me of my favorite joke from Trevor Noah at the time, is when you see one of your favorite celebrities trending on Twitter and you think, please be dead.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, there's quite
because at the time it was just, they were coming down, which it's interesting that that's slowed now. And like, I think there's a whole nother thing to think about there of why.
Right. Like, is it because you think that there's really like, we've got them all? I don't think that's quite the reason.
Right. Exactly.
Anyway.
But yeah, I thought that their perspective on that was interesting. Like I said, I like lean a little bit the other way, but I was open to what they were saying, and, you know.
Yeah, I think that while I'm with you, like, I don't think we've gone too far, because it's like we still don't have the power, you know, like we don't have even like a part of that power or anything like that.
Right.
So it's hard to say we've gone too far, but like, I guess I can sympathize with some of the concerns of other people. And I think the way that they get to that question because they know who their audience is, right?
Right.
So I think it was the way that they get to that sort of resolution rather is interesting because this is where they bring up the worker at McDonald's, her story in, because they're like essentially victims who were sort of lost in the shovel of it all after all these everything was coming out, so the employee's name was Kim Lawson, and she was saying like she didn't know how to reach anyone at like the parent company. She didn't know if McDonald's had like sexual harassment training. Like she didn't know who to contact, and feared if she did contact somebody there would be retaliation. So like it's like those people that like, okay, like people are listening to these stories, but like I'm not famous, like who's going to listen to me, like what's the process, like how do I follow this? And those are like questions that like weren't really resolved in the Me Too movement. So in that way they bring in the that critics of the Me Too movement is almost like they have similar issues. They're like asking the same question as people that like are in the Me Too movement. Like what is the process? What guidelines are we supposed to be following to like be reporting things like this? So I thought it was like, I guess, a clever way of like showing you and highlighting you that like some of these concerns are actually the same between like both sides. So in that way you could see that like the, I guess, feeling of unfairness like mounting, and then those like tensions building because they are asking some of the similar questions.
Sure. And speaking of like still not having gone far enough, I think the food industry is still
like those questions
absolutely waiting for its moment. Yeah.
And they haven't been answered, especially like we've had this conversation, even like locally. Like what about the industries that don't have a corporate, like who do you talk to about those situations?
Well, and I remember when I worked in a restaurant, like you sign that sexual harassment thing that says like, okay, if something happens, tell your boss. Like, what if it is my boss?
Right. Like what's your outlet?
Right. And there isn't one. And that's a huge issue. And that kind of thing where especially if that person decides whether or not you get hours that week and you need them to eat and survive, there just is so many problems there waiting.
For sure. And yeah, it sort of seemed like we were, part of this rolling stone that was like gathering speed and momentum. And then it just seemed to stop all of a sudden. And we're still left with a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to get to Know My Name. The only other thing I was going to say about this is just that, and I think you said it in your Goodreads review, actually, and it's just that the people I want to read this book never will.
Yes.
And especially not just for like the background on Kavanaugh or Trump's accusers or Harvey Weinstein's, but the reason I love this book is that people who are skeptical of the media and reporting and how it works and the process get to actually see how thorough they are. And I think so many people, especially if they just like make offhand remarks about any one organization, and yes, they work for the New York Times, which is probably one of the biggest, that is constantly criticized as if it's a monolith and not just like hundreds and hundreds of people working individually.
Yeah.
I think that like people who aren't familiar with journalism should read this book and see how these stories are reported and see how they are corroborated and fact-checked and just gone over and over and over again until they are airtight.
The number of sources, like...
Yeah, I just wish people would read that and understand that when they talk about stories and when they talk. And like, yeah, can the framing be wrong? Sure, there's plenty to criticize in our media. That's like what this podcast is about. It just like when we're completely dismissive overall, I don't think it's helpful.
Absolutely. So that being said, let's get to another book where the people who need to read it probably won't. Know My Name by Chanel Miller. So I thought this one was interesting, just kind of like overview of it was just so like it grabbed me in a different way than She Said and Catch and Kill did. Catch and Kill and She Said, while there are like some parts that are really sensitive because they're talking about sexual assault and sometimes it does get graphic and hard to hear. This is, you know, her firsthand account of her assault and like her trauma. Like it is a first person, you know, narrative here. And it, I mean, that's what it is. It's personal. You know, where She Said in Catch and Kill, there was a certain amount of proceduralness to it, where you were reading about these horrible things, but like it was still almost like at a distance because, you know, it's people reporting on those things happening. Where this all coming from her firsthand account, I think is powerful in a way that the other ones weren't. Not again saying that the other ones weren't powerful. I think they were just in a different way though.
Yeah. So those who aren't familiar with Know My Name by Chanel Miller, you may know her as Emily Doe. Mm-hmm. And in 2016, kind of remarkably, her victim impact statement went viral. I believe BuzzFeed was the one who published it. And it was at the hearing for Brock Turner after he had been convicted. And the victim impact statement is to kind of help influence what the sentencing should be. Yeah. And it was incredible. I remember reading it at the time and crying, not like really being prepared for how powerful it would be. Yeah. I remember like Joe Biden shared it at the time. It just kind of spread all over. Yeah. And it was kind of right after Brock Turner himself had went viral. Or no, I'm sorry, that was afterwards. Because it wasn't until he didn't get sentenced to 6 months that he went viral. So yeah, it was first. Yeah, though, it just was so well written. And I think like the line that she starts with still gives me chills. You don't know me, but you've been inside me. Yeah. And so she was anonymous up until this point and has now released a memoir. And I just think, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's more.
I think she was still anonymous when that went viral. I think she was still Emily Doe at that point, right? Because I don't think she.
That's what I'm saying. She's anonymous up until the book came out. Yeah. And she kind of decided after a while to take back her own story, but she was a college student at the time, so studying to be a writer, which she clearly is very gifted at. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this is so much more powerful, honestly, than both She Said and Catch and Kill, even though I like them for what they are. Mm-hmm. Just because we talk so much about lost potential or as a society, we talk so much about lost potential and like the effect of the Me Too movement on young boys and blah, blah, blah. And like Chanel paints a perfect picture of like, well, what about me? What about being the victim in this case? And what about if I want to walk at home at night alone? I want to be able to take up space in my world. And that's something she talks about a lot. It's just like, I kind of liked it too from just kind of an urban perspective of someone who loves to walk places, her having to fight with her relatives of whether she should still get to do that, Right. Yeah. He took many more things from her than just that one night,
Right. Absolutely. And I think she does a great job of like constantly reinforcing this throughout the novel. Where it's just like you keep talking about him, but like, what about me? Like you're like almost forgetting the person that this happened to, right, the entire time. So I think she like constantly reiterates that. And I think that's part of like why it was really important. Like her books Know My Name, like why it was really important for her to like sort of like reclaim her story is because through this whole experience, even though this happened to her, like the whole conversation was about him. you know, and it wasn't really